Bugs, we now see the return of one of the greatest series ever put down to film, literature, or even audio. Guys, the Russian Navy sucks Part 8. It is a continuation of a series of tragedies that all come from one country. And while the United States Navy has had its times, and some fairly recently where we shot down our own plane, where we have done something abnormally stupid, nothing compares at all to the inherent majesty of incompetence that comes to play when I think about the Russian Navy. And if you don't think for one second that if you think for any amount of time that this is normal, like, this is not normal for any country under any circumstance to have this many problems in succession over and over and over again. He's going to talk about Soviet heavy cruisers. Okay? I already know half the ship classes that he's going to talk about. And I already know how their profile is for actually engagements and how that's supposed to go. Guys, no matter how, if you're a person who really thinks the Russian Navy is all that, don't get lost in the sauce. There's a reason they have all the weapons on board those ships, because because they don't know how to aim the damn things. And if you don't know what I'm talking about there, I'm pretty sure you're gonna find out. There's gonna be a ship that's shown in here that looks like it's armed to take down a continent, and the thing, heavy cruisers, Russian heavy cruisers. If you read about the Moskva, and you read about all the problems that it had, you kind of understand how Russia lost to a nation that didn't have a navy. Guys, there's going to be somebody down in the comments that says something to the effect of, oh, well, this is just, anti-Russian, blah, blah, blah. This, yes, it is. Why? Because you will never find a more wretched hive of incompetence. Let's just go history of everything. One of my favorite creators, period, when it comes to talking about anything. And the sheer fact of the matter is, watching him do the NBA All-Stars dunk contest on Russia is just sheer entertainment. Let's get into this. Warpugs. All links are going to be in the description down below. Support history of everything. He's done a lot of great work in getting things together for Ukraine. I've been there for a couple of the fundraisers he's done. I hope to be there if he ever does any more. Let's get into it. Let's just go. And I just now read this. The first upload got claimed by a company that claims everything I make because apparently they own all the music from Imperial Russia. I know the pain, my guy. I am a beacon of calm. No, he wasn't. No, he's not. Did I hit play? No. Yes. Oh, yes. Naughty word warning for the Pearl Clutchers to call everyone snowflakes but can't handle listening to the average Australian speak for more than 10 seconds because it hurts their precious sensibilities. Let's go.
Now, we have already talked in depth about Soviet cruisers, specifically the Krasny Kavkaz, that interwar disturbing thing with the stupid guns that need replacing after 25 shots. A pint-sized heavy cruiser, if ever there was one, pushed into a tiny pre-war barnacle-infested reed-covered hull that somehow, through Rasputin-level voodoo and good old horrific self-sacrifice of one of the crew half burning to death, managed to survive the Second World War.
Yay!
But the thing about the Kavkaz is that it was just the beginning, the testbed for those guns, if you will, because there were in fact a grand total of 7 heavy cruisers operated by the USSR from 1939 to 1945. And oh boy were they interesting, because buckle up kiddos as we discuss the joy that was the Kirov class.
If you play this thing in like World of Warships, you might think this is the best thing ever made. That's the problem with playing World of Warships or anything like that. They give you what it was on paper. And on paper, this thing was supposed to be beautiful. I was thinking he was going to be talking about the ones that the USSR had in the early to late 80s, but This is fine.
No, I did not stutter. There really was a Kirov class in World War II. No, not these things. The far better... No, not battlecruiser pieces of crap that everyone and their dog rants about as propaganda pieces that somehow still are good propaganda pieces. They came way after. As we were about to be discovered, the Soviets aren't exactly, we'll say...
Oh, this
creative
is from World of Warships. Why does my brain do things?
when it comes to naming ships. These first ships, the Kirovs, were laid down from 1935 to 1938, and they entered service from 1938 to 1944. And they formed effectively the modern core of the Soviet battle fleet in the Second World War, and in many ways, they form the basis in which the post-war Soviet Navy is built on. But we'll get into that. But first, before we get into all of this, I just want to highlight the difference between a heavy and a light cruiser. Because the naming convention tends to confuse people. See, the distinction only works in World War II, or more aptly, after the naval treaties that define the difference in cruisers.
Treaty of
The
London
difference
being one of
between
them.
a light and a heavy really only comes down to gun size. It isn't armor related at all. It's purely on the guns. A light cruiser uses up to 6-inch guns. A heavy cruiser uses above 6, generally 8-inch guns. So these Soviet cruisers sporting 7-inch guns, well, they technically fall under the heavy cruiser category, hence the title, heavy-ish cruiser.
And the thing about it was, the London Naval Treaty, there was another treaty I can't remember the name of for the life of me because I'm a brain-dead idiot, but there was another naval treaty altogether that put restrictions on sizes. That's why the Bismarck was such a big deal, because it was the majority of the battleships that it fought were built, you know, in line with the naval treaty. So, of course, it's going to be more powerful than them because it simply ignored them. Same with the Yamato.
Cruiser. Also, throughout this video, I'm probably going to include footage from World of Warships of the Kirovs, just because it's a great model of the ship. This is not an endorsement of the game, even though I do play it and I have run ads for them before. Happy to run ads for them again, because, you know, I still play the game. It's just me using the models that I have from the ships I've unlocked in games to show you what they look like. This is not a paid video by World of Warships by any means. Although if you want to play it with me, I'm on the Asia server, and you can absolutely join the HOEYT, History of Everything YouTube clan. I do play, but this is not an endorsement of it. So just want to give you a heads up in case you start wondering about the footage. Anyway, we find ourselves in the interwar years in the Soviet Union.
Yes.
Stalin is in charge after Lenin has made his way to the Great Gulag in the sky.
Yes.
And the Soviet Navy is in the middle of rearming, while Stalin does his level best to shoot anyone who thinks in a way that he slightly disagrees with.
And starving most of the citizens of Ukraine, but let's not even count that. Also, Stalin killed pretty much anybody that had an issue with anything that he ever did, and most of the people that didn't.
The Red Fleet finds itself here in a really sorry state, and it's desperately trying to rearm itself following the revolution. At the fleet's core, there are 3 really old battleships getting refitted to operate in a semi-competent state. More on those horrors another time. Check out Important Naval History, he just did a video on them if you want them now. And 3 small but recently completed Svetlana-class cruisers whose hulls were of Tsarist vintage. Notably the Krasny Krim, Krasny Kavkaz as I mentioned before, and Shivana Ukraina. I can go more into the other ships, the Shivana Ukraina and the Krasny Krim later, and another time if people are interested. But nevertheless, that isn't many ships, let alone any modern ships that could stand up to a modern German squadron.
Nope.
Or a Japanese squadron, or really anyone with 2 sticks and a floating shoe. See, the Germans, if they were coming, which, you know, let's face it, anyone with a brain knew they were, would have their squadrons led by the Scharnhorst or Gneisenau, or on a smaller scale, the Panzerschiffs. Hell, even the Soviet cruisers couldn't stand up to the new German light cruisers in a one-on-one fight. The Nürnberg and the Leipzig could absolutely annihilate these cruisers. Hell, the Königsbergs probably could too, and even the Emden, the new Emden, might have a fair crack at it as well.
And he's just talking about the German fleet. Not even even the Italians would have turned the entire Russian Navy into a fist muppet.
And this is before we even get to destroyers, which the Soviets were horrifically outnumbered and undergunned in. So the Soviets, well, they got a little ambitious here, realizing the situation they were in, and they planned all sorts of super mega death boats, including mega battleships such as the Sovietsky Soyuz, which, if completed, could be compared to a Soviet Iowa or Yamato. No, it was never happening. It was never going to get completed, but that's the plan, roughly.
No, this is the thought that counts.
They also planned a great big battle cruiser, which is modelled-ish in World of Warships as Stalingrad. I mean, we kind of think it may have looked like that. It probably wouldn't have. Could have been looked like this, which is the Kronstadt, which is also in the game. But you get the gist. It was a large armed cruiser with big guns. That's kind of the idea of it. Sort of a contemporary to the Alaska class from the Americans. But either way, down the food chain, the officers in charge putting their fantasy boats away decided to reach out to a country that actually had a navy that worked. So they went to the one place that would be willing to help them that they hadn't pissed off royally, Italy. The Italians helped the Soviets during this early period in the 30s immensely, and after partnering with the Italians on the destroyer Tashkent, the Soviets set about completing the second 5-year plan's goal of building 8 new powerful cruisers under what would be dubbed Project 26.
Now, you see, I didn't know about this. I didn't know that they got help from the Italians at all, but it does make sense. The Italians, while you don't hear about them that much, they did have a very competent navy.
Well, initially dubbed Project 26. Couple problems here though. Soviet industry was working already at its complete limit, and they had never actually built anything of this size or scope. Initially, the plan was to purchase a cruiser from the Italians and then sort of work from there. But this didn't work out, and so the Italian designers helped the Soviets on the design of the Type 26. And you can genuinely see just how heavy the Italian influence was by merely looking at the ships. This is right here is what the Kirov would become. And this is the Montecuccoli. You can visibly see the design similarity, but see, the thing is, this was the Soviet Union, and actually listening to the Italians, the people who knew what they were talking about, well, you know.
Just use Fakolka. Let's go.
I'm just going to repeat. This was the Soviet Union.
Communist-flavored spaghetti. Is communist-flavored spaghetti made out of nothing? Tastes like air?
Now, I should preface, the Italian cruisers during the Second World War, the ones that Project 26 shared an ancestry with, they were absolutely magnificent ships. They were well armed, they were fast, and in all respects, gorgeous. But, you know, it's an Italian machine, so no shocks there that it's absolutely stunning. The first 2 ships of Project 26 had so many issues, in fact, that the last 4 would be completed to a significantly altered design known as Project 26 BIS, or BIS. Kirov and Voroshilov, the first 2, for example, were constantly down at the bow and couldn't sail on an even keel because the weight was just so poorly spread. The fixes to the ships were then further delayed because Stalin again started shooting people, including shipbuilders, designers, and well, everyone he felt like. Eventually, the issues were ironed out or smoothed over through redesigns such as removing the giant mast, the tripod, reshaping the hull, tinkering and increasing the armor to prevent cracking, and the 4 other ships were laid down and completed to this revised design. They were the Maxim Gorki, Molotov, later renamed Slava when Vyacheslav Molotov fell out of favor because, yes, they named ships after people who were in government at the time.
True.
Incoming USS Musk, Kalinin, and Kagnovich. The last ship in this class would first be renamed from Kagnovich to Lazar Kagnovich after Mikhail Kagnovich fell out of favor, and then renamed to Petropavlovsk after the second Kagnovich fell out of favor because Soviet Union.
It's not a joke. It's not a joke or an exaggeration to say that Stalin killed pretty much anybody who wasn't currently a brown-noser for him and posed any sort of any nominal threat whatsoever. He killed all of those people, threw them in, either killed them straight out or threw them into gulags, and then you had anybody that would dissent against him publicly. They would go to gulags. The purges are the reason why quite literally no one in the Red Army knew how to fight worth a damn, and the purges are also why the Russian Navy was so god-awful during the early part of the USSR into the late era of the USSR, because anybody that gained a little bit of popularity and power, they wound up an enemy of the state.
The Kirov and Maxim Gorki would enter service in 38 and 40, respectively, and would be based in the Baltic. The Voroshilov and the Molotov in 40 and 41, and in the Black Sea, and the last two would enter service in the Pacific. Each ship was armed impressively with 9 7-inch or 180mm guns and 3 triple turrets, with torpedoes and smaller secondaries, along with a catapult for a seaplane. Interestingly, due to the changes needed to actually make these ships seaworthy and not, bobbing around like a cork down at the bow, the crew number on the Kirov at launch was 692, while the upgraded Gorki required a whopping 898 men aboard.
How long was it?
And the Kalinin 812. Eventually, the Kirov, once it was refitted and refitted and refitted multiple times, would also need a crew size in the 800s. Their Italian pedigree became increasingly obvious when you actually look at the speed, though, which is a whopping 36 knots. Just like their half-cousins in Italy, they were quick. But as with all purchases and designs shared from Italy, and this is a problem that really was across the Soviet Union's fleet with Italian ships, metal fatigue became an increasing issue in colder climates. So the thing is, Italian ships, although amazingly well designed, were designed for Italian purposes.
Right.
Shocking. Italian purposes doesn't involve sailing a ship up inside the Arctic Circle. It's
yes.
Not a thing, and it also doesn't have to deal with seas outside the Mediterranean. So, again, these are issues that were kind of known about, but sort of swept under the rug because there was really no one else who would help them. One of the biggest issues, like I said before, was cracking. So the hulls, just the metal not being strong enough to handle the extreme cold, and it would crack and warp. The Gnezdin-class destroyer had this issue too, with a couple of situations where large cracks would form, and in one situation, the bow of a ship completely fell off.
Yeah, that's not very typical. I'd like to...
Hold on a second. I gotta back this up, because right when my wife calls, he said something very, very important.
Completely fell off.
Fell off? Yeah, that's not very typical.
So the hulls, just the metal not being strong enough to handle the extreme cold, and it would crack and warp. The Gnezdin-class destroyer had this issue too, with a couple of situations where large cracks would form, and in one situation, the bow of a ship completely fell off.
Fell off? Yeah, that's not very typical. I'd like to make that point.
The Kirovs were a decent start though, and they would each have a relatively interesting career, and given the fact that I haven't done a Russian Navy video in a while, rather than sum them up shortly, I'm going to give you a play-by-play of every single ship's career.
Let's go. Kirov.
Now, Kirov started her career in a very Soviet fashion.
Okay.
So after her initial workup, her first mission was...
Did they just grab a whole bunch of peasants and toss them in with zero training and then wound up mucking about until they did something absolutely asinine, probably involving some Scandinavian country? Maybe?
To support the Soviet invasion and occupation of the Baltics, sailing into Riga on the 22nd of October 1939. The teething issues of the new cruiser were still showing heavily at this point though, because although she technically joined the fleet in September 1938, workers were required on board well into 1939 due to the constant breakdowns and problems arising. During the Winter War, the Kirov would set sail with 2 destroyers to bombard the Finnish coastal batteries.
Okay.
But this was cut short when the Finns actually shot back. And shot back.
Somebody get that phone.
Back with alarming accuracy.
Oh.
Because nothing beats an angry Finnish person. Not wanting to risk the new ship's propaganda value, because let's be real, losing a giant cruiser just after it's been built, it was not going to look good.
Yeah, and who loses an entire fleet, much less a ship, much less one of the most important ships in your navy, to a country that doesn't have a navy, am I right? Am I right?
The Soviets ordered it withdrawn, and it spent the remainder of the Winter War in Kronstadt needing repairs because of how accurate the Finnish gunners were in bracketing the ship. The German invasion in June 1941 actually found the Kirov stuck in the Gulf of Riga, supporting Soviet destroyers in laying mines. But again, it was stuck. It was unable to leave the Gulf because the Germans moved so quickly. So the captain and the officers aboard, refusing to allow their ship to be sunk or captured, did the only thing they could. They offloaded all their ammunition, added most of the fuel and as much weight as possible, and ran the ship through the incredibly shallow Moon Sound Channel, escaping towards Tallinn, where after taking on more ammunition, they assisted in the defense of the city. When Tallinn fell, the ship acted as the flagship for the evacuation fleet, and they made their way to Leningrad. It was in Leningrad where she would stay for most of the war, acting as a floating battery and anti-air platform, getting her guns beefed up for anti-air purposes as the war progressed. Kirov would be bombed relentlessly during the war, being damaged repeatedly, with one bomb destroying her aft funnel, her mainmast, and killing 86 aboard. The cruiser, heavily damaged, would provide gunfire support with the Soviet counteroffensives, and then would be sent for repairs. The war was effectively over though, because of the amount of damage, and shortly after the war the ship would be damaged again by an unexploded German mine, needing more repairs. Kirov would actually stay in service as a training cruiser until 1961, floating around after 61 until being scrapped in 1974, and this ship was known for constant visits to Poland and East Germany.
Maxim Gorki.
The Kirov was joined in the Baltic by the Maxim Gorki in November 1940, and together it was intended that these two cruisers would form the very core of the Baltic fleet. But things really didn't go to plan, because on the 23rd of June 1941, quite literally their second day of Operation Barbarossa, the Gorki and accompanying destroyer Nevny sailed right into a minefield. And they had their bows, both totally blown off. Now, there are two sources I saw on this event. One says that it was a complete accident. The other says that the captain knew there was a minefield there, but kind of got lost and just sailed it anyway because he thought it was somewhere else. Could have been either. It really depends on the source, and I haven't actually gone through and determined whether or not the source was biased to one side or the other, because quite frankly, it's not important. The Maxim Gorki hit a mine. Mines get hit in war. So, yeah, whatever. It's just a small anecdote. Either way, with the ship's bow blown off, the crew actually had to get and limp back all the way to Leningrad, and
I'm actually stunned it didn't sink the ship, to be honest with you.
They did this successfully, where they had a new bow fitted after a time, and much like her sister Kirov, the Maxim Gorki lived under siege, an air attack, using their guns to assist the defense of the city. Gorki would linger until 1956, actually testing the first Soviet helicopter at sea, which is quite interesting. Before being scrapped in 1959.
Voroshilov. I can't even.
Compared to the life of cold, misery and siege that the Baltic pair experienced, the war in the Black Sea was fought at a far higher tempo. The Voroshilov technically launched in 1937 with much pomp and circumstance, but due to the ongoing purges, factories in the Soviet naval space were suffering, and it wouldn't be until 1940, almost 4 years later, that the engines for the ship actually arrived, delaying her entry in service until June that year. Voroshilov would begin the war firing offshore bombardments against Romanian coastal ports and guarding destroyers while they did so as well, and later against advancing German forces, a task in which she would continue until she was bombed by Junkers 88s, sustaining moderate damage that required her to be towed to Poti for repairs. The ship would later return to service in early 1942, again to act as shore bombardment support. But remember those teething issues I mentioned? Well, the lack of experience in building effective turbines for ships this large that could be used for ongoing periods of time without regular maintenance was just something the Soviet Union was not very good at doing. And it led to the ship breaking down that May, and it meant that she needed more repairs. Voroshilov would be totally withdrawn from service after the loss of 3 destroyers, though, in an operation attempting to cut off the German advance, with Stalin himself fearing the loss of such a large vessel for propaganda purposes, and for Voroshilov that meant her war was effectively over. Voroshilov would actually later be chosen as a testbed for new Soviet missiles, and she would linger until 1972, where she would then spend a year as a floating barracks, aka a floating storehouse, before being scrapped in 1973. You can actually still find part of the Voroshilov in the form of a propeller and an anchor in the occupied city of Sevastopol today.
Molotov.
Molotov joined Voroshilov in 1941, and she actually had a unique feature, being that she was the only ship in the Soviet Union at the time equipped with radar.
Oh.
And because of this, the Molotov was ordered to park itself in Sevastopol and act as a very heavily armed air warning station for incoming German attacks, before the German advance forced her relocation. Molotov would later be used as a high-speed transport and to bombard German forces before her stern was quite literally blown off by a HE-111 in August 1942. The cruiser was able to limp back to Patoy using her propellers to actually steer, and she was repaired in a very interesting way by welding the stern of a Chapayev-class light cruiser, the Frunz, the rudder of the Zheleznikov, the steering gear from the yet completed cruiser Kagnovich, her sister in the Pacific Ocean, it was shipped back over, and parts of a nearby submarine. The Mad Max Molotov was now ready to rejoin the fleet, but as with Voroshilov, Stalin feared the loss of the ship and confined her to port. After the war, she would actually be used as a testbed for radars and would suffer a fire so bad her magazine had to be flooded at the cost of 22 lives.
Wow. A fire on board a Russian ship. Imagine my shock.
In order to stop the ship exploding. In 1957, the ship was renamed after the very human and not at all ship-like politician Molotov attempted to coup Nikita Khrushchev. The newly minted Slava, which is interesting because Vyacheslav Molotov's nickname was sometimes Slava. Yeah, okay. Would sail to Syria to show solidarity with the country during the Six-Day War in 1967 before assisting destroyer Bravyi after her collision with HMS Ark Royal. Slava, aka Molotov, would finally be scrapped in 1972.
Okay. Not even going to try. Not even going to make an attempt at this.
Kagnovich and Kalin. Now, these two last ships don't really need their own section because they both entered the fleet relatively late in 42 and 44, and it was in the Pacific.
Oh.
With the Kagnovich not actually being completed until 1947. Now, Kagnovich suffered in her construction due to the German invasion, with her propellers being stuck in Leningrad under siege, and her prop shafts barely escaping Stalingrad before the battle.
Okay.
The dockyard she was built in was also violently corrupt and poorly maintained too, with the roof of one of the docks actually falling onto the ship during its construction. During this period, the ship had a very Soviet turn of events, with the ship first being renamed from Kagnovich to Lazar Kagnovich in 1945 because Mikhail Kagnovich fell out of favor with Stalin.
Of course.
And then in 1967, after Lazar attempted to join Molotov in his little coup attempt, she was again renamed to Petropavlovsk.
Okay.
The ship was deemed surplus to requirements and nearly sold to the Chinese Navy, but the Sino-Soviet split intervened. Damaged by a typhoon and deemed a waste of space, the Kagnovich was scrapped in the 60s. Kalinin, meanwhile, entered the Pacific Fleet in 1942, and in early 43,
Congratulations.
The ship would have a relatively uneventful career during the war, undertaking training exercises, but very nearly being sent through the Northern Arctic passages all the way over to join the Northern Fleet.
This would have only ended in tears.
This was abruptly cancelled though, and the ship sat in port and really did not much, nothing at all. During the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and the brief Soviet war against Japan, the ship was actually in port for minor repairs and saw out the war without firing a shot in anger.
Yeah, I don't think that even with as much of a beating as Japan took, that the Soviets would really want to tangle with the Japanese Navy after what happened to them only a couple of decades prior. And he's been talking about the cold weather affecting steel. That's not a joke. That's why a lot of U.S. Navy ships are built in Bath, Maine.
It's believed that the Soviets were not intending to risk the ship at all at war with Japan due to Stalin's order of not losing any ships after those 3 destroyers were sunk by the Germans. Kalinin was mothballed in 1956 and then finally scrapped in 1963.
Okay.
So that's the story of the Kirovs, 6 cruisers of questionable use who never really were tested in ship-to-ship combat,
Okay.
but nevertheless performed decently. Given the fact that 2 spent their war locked in port and 2 did effectively nothing, we really need to look at the Molotov and Voroshilov to get an idea of their effectiveness, and from these ships, we can see that they were pretty decent. But one thing that always followed these ships around was the blinding inaccuracy of their guns. After what would be considered small bombardments, and that came down to extreme wear and tear on what was a weak gun barrel. Further to this, the guns were very, very large and pushed close together, causing some salvos to just completely fire off into the distance. The lack of history in dealing with turbines too for ships this size caused a problem. So did the lack of facilities to maintain the ships, but I won't hold that against the Soviets because, well, they were at war.
I will most certainly hold it against them every single time. You had a country that was trying to teach you how to do this stuff. And instead of actually listening to that country that was willing to teach you how to get this stuff done, Smakulka.
In all, they did okay though. Nothing magnificent, but by all accounts, they were decent. If you ignore the fact they can't really operate in really cold climates, they were very good. But I mean, for the service in the Black Sea, they were absolutely fine.
Yeah, that's fine.
But Mr. So-called history of everything you may say, this all seems very calm and normal. And hang on, didn't you say 7 heavyish cruisers? Can you not count? This is clearly 6. I will now write a 7-paragraph comment on your inability to count in the comments. Well, dear viewer, you may have noticed I left one ship out there.
Okay.
Petropavlovsk.
Yes.
And to that you will say, no, you didn't. That's what Kagnovich was renamed.
Right.
And yeah, you're right. But for some goddamn reason, the Soviets can't think of more than 8 different bloody names for heavy cruisers. So here we are. It's time to talk about the Petropavlovsk.
Okay. Let's go.
Now, back in 1939 in August, the two
Now kiss.
worst salespeople for the optics of mustaches got their little hate-filled brains together and decided that there was in fact room for 2 people on the podium of world's biggest asshole. But make no mistake, they didn't actually meet each other, they sent their little underlings in their place to sign an alliance. We now know as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Yep.
Make no mistake, this was no buying time pact, there was no 7D chess as revisionists would have you believe. This was a genuine alliance between the Kremlin and the Reichstag, between the Star and the Swastika, and on how they would carve up Eastern Europe and Southern Europe and deal with the issues of Poland and the Baltics.
Yep.
The Soviets, for their part, would receive Finland, Eastern Poland and the Baltics in their sphere, while the Germans would gain Western Poland and the Balkans. The Nazis would also receive immense amounts of resources through their mineral deal with the Soviets while providing the Soviets with military equipment to assist their rebuilding. One of the lesser known terms of this deal was the transfer of the as yet incomplete Admiral Hipper-class heavy cruiser, the Lutzau, which had been launched in 1939 just before the invasion of Poland. Now, if you want to know anything about the Lutzau...
I didn't know about this. I didn't know about this particular part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but yeah.
You may want to consider ships like the Prinz Eugen, the ship that famously accompanied the Bismarck,
right,
or the Blucher, the ships that the Norwegians went completely to town on. The Lutzau was a sister of these ships. It was built to the same design. Well, sort of, but we'll get into that. So it's actually very, very large in terms of ship size. The Lutzau was sold to the Soviet Union on the 11th of February and renamed the Petropavlovsk. Now, one thing I will say is if you go to Google this after this video, be mindful of the fact that the moment this Lutzau was sold to the Soviet Union, there was another Lutzau renamed, which was the former Panzer ship Deutschland, which Hitler renamed from Deutschland to Lutzau because he thought it would be embarrassing if a ship called Deutschland was sunk during a war, because Deutschland just means Germany.
True.
It's all very
stupid
dictatorial, ego-y, but
yeah,
this is why so many names keep getting used over and over and over again, because I swear to God, dictators have no sense of style when it comes to naming ships.
Zero.
The intention was that once the ship was transferred on the 11th of Feb and renamed, that Germans would join them in St. Petersburg and they would trade raw resources with the Soviet Union in return for arms to help finish the ship. It's a pretty simple idea.
Leningrad, help finish. I see what you did there.
The Germans would then use these raw resources to invade France, the Low Countries, and fight the British Empire. And all they had to do was help build a single cruiser.
Mm-hmm.
Now, although everything went to plan initially, it was always the plan of the Nazis to expand east, which, in hindsight, reading and listening to literally anything Hitler has ever said in his life, after the First World War that is, it was kind of a given. It became very obvious very fast that the Soviets were getting shafted too, as the Germans dragged their feet on finishing the ship, which was only about 70% complete at the time of the German invasion in 1941.
And here's the thing. The dude literally put out a book detailing what he said needed to be done. Did no one read the damn thing when this guy came to power?
Now, although incomplete, the crew had largely been assigned to the ship, and the Germans had begrudgingly supplied ammunition and weapons to the point where the ship could be brought into service as a floating battery. As designed, the ship was intended to have 8 8-inch guns. However, by 1941, she had 2 turrets installed, giving her 4 working guns, along with a smattering of anti-air weapons. To give it perspective, this ship weighed in at 10,000 tons semi-complete. It was supposed to be about 17,000 when finished, but hey, 4 8-inch guns is nothing to sneeze at, and it would work as a floating battery.
Yay.
So the crew was ordered to prepare for war. Much of the crew naturally wasn't needed in this new role of a floating boomhouse, and many of the men were assembled in 2 companies and repurposed to serve as naval infantry, while some others were sent to ships that were scattered around the Soviet Union.
Right.
The Petropavlovsk itself was towed to a mooring near Factory 189 in Leningrad, and then
Christ.
commissioned into the fleet, bombarding the Germans approaching the city with, ironically enough, German shells fired from German guns on a German hull towards German soldiers. Hitler didn't think that one through, did he?
No.
Eventually, the German artillery found the range of the ship, and after smacking it with over 50 shells, the mobile floating battery, which asked for tugs to come and move it, and the tug captain sort of went, "Nah, we're busy," settled on the bottom, with its guns intact but everything else more than a little aquatic. The Soviets, seeing that the guns worked, ordered men back aboard. Those who weren't ordered aboard were again sent to the front, this time in a suicidal counterattack because
Of course.
the Soviet Union. By September 1942, the ship was repaired enough to be considered somewhat floating.
Somewhat floating is not a good term to use when you're speaking about a naval ship. I'm just throwing that out there.
That's effectively the translation I got when I read the source. It was
Oh my god.
marginally floating, or marginally buoyant was the rough translation, so go with that. Just very full of water while doing it, and it was towed into Leningrad port to be repaired a bit,
Okay.
where she was again, after some repairs, towed out to fire off 6 rounds at the German forces. In January the next year, the ship again provided fire support, but by the 24th of January, the ship had fired its last rounds. For some reason, the ship was then renamed to Tallinn from Petropavlovsk. Don't know why, it just was, and there was a brief chance at it being completed, and the idea was, we think, by renaming it, that they were going to use it as a propaganda piece by using salvaged parts from the captured cruiser Seydlitz to try and finish the thing. Now, the Seydlitz itself was actually a bastardized Admiral Hitler-class cruiser midway into a conversion to an aircraft carrier by the Nazis, but that was also not to be, and instead the ship was used for accommodation, and then the Tallinn, aka Petropavlovsk, was scrapped after being renamed again twice in the 1950s. It kind of, yeah, it's 50-50 on what their plan was after the war. Some people say that it was going to be completed with these parts taken from the Seydlitz. There's one theory out there that the Soviets were really annoyed that the Americans got their hands on the Prinzel again because they wanted to use the Prinzel again to fix up the Tallinn, aka Petropavlovsk. But we really just do not know. It's really up in the air. We have no idea what happened. So, yeah. And that's it. The Soviets, although planning 8, managed to get 7 heavy-ish cruisers in the water in various ways, just before or just after the during the Second World War.
Okay.
It wasn't pretty, it wasn't the most effective, but they smakalked their way into making it work.
Hooray.
The Kirovs, for their part, would provide excellent practices, though, to the Soviets, who would use this experience to actually build the much more large and effective light cruisers of the Chapayev and Sverdlov class.
Now, those ships were actually worth a crap.
Tallinn, or Petropavlovsk, or Lutzau, or Dnieper, or PKZ-112. It's all the same ship, just pick a name and roll with it, for God's sake. Well, it was evidence of a deal made by the Soviets to help the Nazis as their allies. So it doesn't get talked about as much, but
of course
hey,
not.
One day I might just go out of my way to make a nice long video about how the Germans got so much help from the Soviets before 1941 that the war itself was prolonged purely thanks to the stupid mustache boys and their stupid alliance.
Right.
I do have the book for it after all, Feeding the German Eagle. Fantastic book. Anyway, I will catch you all next time. Probably with another Soviet video.
Please do.
But I really like your input because YouTube is absolutely forcing us towards an algorithm. And I'll be honest, I don't want to live by an algorithm. I'd much rather make videos like this that I enjoy making.
There you go.
And I feel like when I enjoy making a video, it comes across and you enjoy hearing it more. But hey, maybe I'm completely wrong and talking out my ass. Just let me know. Anyway,
that's what I do now.
I will catch you all next time. Special thanks to one of my supporters for sending me an amazing book that has helped with the writing of this script immensely. It was so full of information and sources on where I could get extra information. I could not have done it without you. And I won't say your name out loud because the book actually came with your real name, and I doubt you want that shared. But blame Jeff Bezos and not me for doing that. Either way, this madman also sent me the HMT Olympic. Yeah, the Titanic sister ship in 1/200 scale. So you might get a stream of that monster being built one day soonish. That or the Kuznetsov or HMS Warspite. Look, I've got a few models, okay? Maybe I'll put a poll up and let you choose between Kuznetsov, Olympic, and Warspite. Who knows?
Dude, the Warspite. Let's go.
I mean, I do. It's probably not going to be the Kuznetsov for a little while because that thing was doing my head in. But I mean, I do need to get it finished. It was almost done. So, yeah, hey ho.
Guys, so the period of time immediately after World War II, that's when the Soviets started to actually get their act together, in my opinion, as far as naval doctrines and doing things correctly would be concerned. They were okay-ish for about 20 years. When, like, they had a submarine fleet that was, you know, that was really overhyped considering a few things that I won't go into. Let's just say I know a little bit more about that than most. Their submarine fleet was kind of overhyped. It was a literal... There was problems with it. Let's just say that. And it was only through the actions of the KGB they actually got a scary submarine fleet. It was only through the actions of the KGB and a couple of one particular guy who it annoys me to even consider this person shared the same rate as me when he was in the U.S. Navy, but it's only because of him and a few other things that happened that gave them a competent submarine force. As far as their surface ships went, from the, I'd say, the mid-50s to around the mid-70s, anything that they designed in the mid-50s to about the mid-70s was halfway decent, but anything that they put to the water after around 77 was pretty much destined to fail the second that somebody looked at it wrong. There was a lot of problems. That's when, like, the early 80s, in particular, after about 84, the Soviets really, really began to suffer, and the bloated military budget was running into heavy problems when it came to their naval side of things. There was very little question, and there's very little, was very little question for me if they had fought a war against our Navy because of a couple of different things. In the early 80s to mid 80s, that the Russian Navy had a monstrous advantage at that point. But it was not because of the actual talent of their Navy or the ships that they had. It was the intelligence advantage that they had because of the KGB and one person in very much particular. Aside from all that, guys, history of everything has once again shown us the way. I, for some reason, conflated heavy cruiser and battle cruiser in my head. I don't know why. It's because my brain is dyslexic some days. I thought he was going to talk about some of the ships of the late Soviet era, which were complete and utter trash, to be honest with you. They could not keep up with advances in American technology. So instead of doing things, instead of actually coming to grips with that, they just decided, well, let's just throw a whole bunch of guns on it, a whole bunch of missile systems, and pray for the best. That was generally the idea. Guys, I'm gonna head out from here. Check the links in the description below for history of everything. Remember, guys, good times do rhyme with war crimes. Check the links in the description below from my shop. Pick yourself up a shirt. And I will catch you guys next time. Just remember, war thugs. You gotta name your fleet. You gotta have good names for your big ships. Otherwise, everything just sucks. I'll catch you guys next time. The front of the ship fell off. That's just funny.